Good evening, everybody. There's a few people, I think, just coming in. My name is Doug Peers. I'm the Dean of Arts from, as we call it, across the creek. Most of you know what that means. For those of you who don't, St. Jerome's and our affiliated colleges on this and the universities on this side of the little creek, the University of Waterloo, are connected by a series of bridges. Hence, part of the reason for the name of tonight's lecture. And what it symbolizes is the degree to which we collaborate to bring together events such as this, where we're combining not only our communities, but also the disciplines in ways intended to stimulate discussion and trigger debates. It's the fifth year of the Bridges Lecture Series, and its focus is principally upon mathematics and the arts. It's a joint effort between the University of Waterloo, faculties of mathematics, faculty of art, and St. Jerome's University. And we've had further support this year, to which we're very grateful, from the Fields Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences. So it's the Bridge Lectures, and this is the fifth year. I've been here 5 years, so I've lived the dream, so to speak. Somebody who, when I first came here 5 years ago, who told me you could fill a room on a Friday night at a university campus in Canada, I would have thought they were, well, nuts. You would never, at my previous institutions, ever try and get a public lecture on a Friday night. You would even hesitate to do it on a Thursday night. And a Friday night, given the parking chaos and the traffic in the city, I think, it's still quite amazing. But every time we do it, we get great turnouts. And it speaks not only to the wider interest in the kind of intersections that this series affords us as a community, but I think what it also speaks to is the degree to which this is a remarkably engaged community in Kitchener and Waterloo. And so before introducing and welcoming our speakers, I would like to do something a little bit different, and that's to thank you, the audience, for reminding us of just how valuable these opportunities can be, because it's your willingness to come out on a Friday night and participate in these events, which tells us of there is a very rich future in what can be broadly termed the liberal arts and sciences. I was at a conference earlier this week in Montreal, convened by Universities Canada, the old Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada, and it was on the future of the liberal arts. There were not a lot of people who were looking terribly optimistic there. I would like to bring that audience here tonight and say, have a look at who's coming out on a Friday night and seeing people willing to come out and look at those intersections, bringing their own expertise, but more importantly, their curiosity about how their interests can intersect with others. So again, thank you very much for, again, providing such a welcome demonstration of the value and the potential of collaboration in the area of mathematics and arts. So tonight's talk is mathematics, music, and visual arts. We have two speakers. The format for these events, each of the speakers will speak for roughly about 35 minutes. I ask you to hold your questions till the end, and then at the end, I'll come back on the stage and we'll moderate an open session on questions for about 30 minutes. Our first speaker, and I'm giving them in their alphabetical order. I'm hoping this is the order they come up in. Otherwise, you're going to have to make a quick alphabetical shift, but there's only two, so it's going to be too difficult. Our first speaker is Nathan Selikoff. He works with interactivity. Oh, we're going to do vice versa. Okay, I'm gonna flip around. Okay, ignore that last few minutes. Our first speaker tonight will be Dmitri Timoshko, composer and theorist based at Princeton University. His book, Geometry of Music, is available from Oxford University Press. Author of 24 articles, and also released several CDs. Beat Therapy and Crackpot Hymnal are two that come to mind. He was also the author of the first ever article on music theory published by Science magazine, and a recipient of numerous awards, the Guggenheim Foundation, Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, American Academy of Arts and Letters, Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics, and other organizations. He'll be our first presenter. He'll be followed by Nathan Selikoff, who is going to be, whose work focuses on interactivity and motion in time and space. He looks and draws reference from the behavior of systems, science, nature, and music, using computer code, traditional materials, and future technology to bring new ideas to life. His artwork has been exhibited and performed all around the world, United States, etc. He loves traveling. It's a very great way of combining the two of them. And he's represented by Snapspace in Florida, Bangkok, and Amsterdam. So without further ado, I'd like Dmitri to start off this evening's presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I need to begin with a few announcements. The first announcement is that I do not usually sound like this. I have two small children who make me terribly sick all the time, and a few days ago I thought I wasn't even going to be able to get out of bed in order to come here. So I sound like a frog, and we're just going to have to put up with it. Usually when I give talks about music, I will demonstrate points by singing. And so this afternoon I thought, maybe I should try that. And I found that I actually cannot sing. And it's worse than my normal situation where I just can't make beautiful notes. I literally cannot make notes at all. And so I hope I don't forget that and try to sing in the middle of this lecture. The second thing I want to say is that I want to thank the many people who helped bring this event to fruition. When Benoit Charbonneau, Alicia Kalensis, Krista Blake, Edwin Outwater, and the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony, and of course, Nathan Selikoff. When I was asked to give this lecture, I was told that the way things usually work is that there will be a scientist and an artist. And so I was talking to Benoit, and I said, well, which one do you want me to be? And we got to talking, and one thing led to another, and I realized that the way we're doing it is we actually have two speakers who combine something scientific or quantitative and something artistic. And what we're doing here, what's going to happen tonight is I'm going to begin by giving a very general introduction to the connection between music and geometry, and I will talk about work that I've been doing over the last 10 years or even more. And that work is leading to the production of a new artwork, which will be performed next month by the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony, which is a piece of music that I wrote that explores these geometrical ideas in a creative way. And then Nathan will be providing live visuals for that new artwork. And so after I get done giving background, he's going to come up and talk about how you translate geometry first into music and then back into geometry. So that's the agenda for tonight. So I am now going to talk about why music is geometrical. And let me get my software up and running, make that go away. The first point I want to make is that musical notes live on a line. Okay, and you can actually see that most clearly in the design of lots of our musical instruments, like the piano keyboard. The piano keyboard has two directions you can go. You can go up or down. And so we can translate. Now let's see if I can get this to make notes. We can think of a musical note as picking out a point on a line. Okay, and so that really is the origin of the relation between music and geometry. Our perception of pitch is ordered from low to high. Now, that's maybe the simplest possible geometrical model of music, and things are going to get complicated very quickly. The first thing you might want to ask is, what if you've got more than one note? And in that case, there are really two things that you can do. One thing you can do is what the piano does, which is imagine that there are multiple points in the same line. So we play two notes on the piano keyboard. And we can imagine these notes moving around. Oops, sorry. Okay. So this is, in a way, the representation of multiple notes that is most comfortable to us. It is the one that we are intuitively engaging in when we sit at a piano or any comparable instrument like a marimba or a vibraphone or something like that. This is not how mathematicians like to think. the way mathematicians would prefer to think is that instead of putting a bunch of points in the same space, you can assign each different note its own space. And so this is what mathematicians call the configuration space. And so what ends up happening here is that we think of two-note music as living in a two-dimensional space. If you move one note, you're moving upwards. If you move the other note, you're moving horizontally. And of course, three-note music would live in three-dimensional space. Four-note music would live in four-dimensional space. And Spem in Alium by Thomas Tallis would live in 50-dimensional space, right? So this is where complexity is going to start to enter the picture. Excuse me. So this is the picture that we are going to be working with today. And I think, bear with me, I have a magic device here that can sense my hand position. And so I think I might be able to demonstrate the multidimensional nature of music. Oh, sorry. Stop! I'm doing something terrible. So here I am moving one hand left and right, and you can sort of see my a single ball moving, and then let's turn on the other dimension. And now I am moving my hand in a two-dimensional space, and you can see those balls on the line gamely trying to follow what my hands are doing. Okay, enough of that. Now, okay, so the first source of geometrical complexity comes when we assign every instrument or every musical voice its own dimension. The second cause of musical complexity is that musicians like to disregard certain kinds of difference. In particular, if you observe the structure of the piano keyboard that's up here, you will notice that there's a pattern, right? There are 2 black notes, and then 3 black notes, and then 2 black notes, and then 3 black notes. And so this represents the fact that we perceive pitch as having additional structure beyond just the linear structure. There is inside this line a kind of periodic or repeating structure such that as we move up and down, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, eventually takes us via what I call Maria's theorem back to do, right? And so what that means is we perceive pitch periodically. So one way that people have tried to represent this periodic nature of musical structure is by having a line that's actually a helix and has the circular dimension built into it, right? So if you imagine flattening out the circle, you could stretch it and make it look more like a line, or you could look at it this way and suddenly disregard the what octave you're in. Okay, so the first kind of difference that musicians try to ignore is they ignore the difference between this C and that C and that C and that C, and instead they represent music as points on a circle. Okay, so now, as we play music, whoops, they shouldn't be crossing like that. Let me see if I can play more accurately. Ah, jazz crept in. Okay, so now, going back to what I said before, it's relatively easy to imagine multiple points on a circle. But if we assign each musical instrument its own dimension, then what we're talking about is a kind of space which has a circle going off in, many different directions. And this is a space that mathematicians call a torus. The other thing I just want to mention now, our piano keyboard is in a way a very restrictive musical instrument because it requires you to exist at only certain spots in the space of musical possibilities. And this is why people in certain other cultures find the piano to be a horrendous instrument. Anyone who's ever tried to sing, and I will not do that now, knows that between adjacent keys on the piano keyboard, there is a ton of room. So you should really think of these spaces as being continuous spaces. And when I was playing with my little hand wavy thing, I was actually, you could hear the notes gliding from one point to another. Now, I do want to go back to that because I think I can give you a sense of what it's like to ignore octave. So let me see if this works. There's something called a shepherd tone. So I'm going to move my hand left and right, and instead of hearing a note fall, you should hear something different. Well, you'll hear falling, but you'll hear something else too. Oh, sorry. Okay, let me see if I can do this right. So hopefully what you hear, that's called a shepherd tone. And if I could move my hand with exquisite precision, what you would hear is a note that's falling but never getting any lower. It is an auditory version of the barbershop illusion, the barber pole illusion. And what's happening is that you're hearing the note in every possible octave. And as you move down, the note starts to come in very quietly at the very top of your hearing. And so it's actually possible to construct a space where you can move around, but you never leave the compass of a single octave. So you can actually move your hands around in a three-dimensional toroidal space. And in that space, you're moving your hands in three-dimensional space, but what you'll find out is that being over here, and being over here, and being over here are all the same sound. And so that's the complexity that we are dealing with when we are dealing with geometrical spaces that model music as musicians like to think of it. Okay, so just to reiterate, musicians like to ignore certain kinds of differences. One difference is the difference between different notes in different octaves. Instead of talking about this particular key or this particular key, we just talk about C in general, and we ignore what octave it's in. The other thing that I want to talk about is how musicians think about musical relatedness. So here we have 3 notes on the circle, and they sound like that. And we call this the C major chord. Now I'm going to play the E major chord. Oh. That's the C major chord. That's the E major chord. That's the F major chord. That's the G major chord. It turns out that all of these chords, oh, that's a minor chord. All of these chords are related, and they get the same name, major chord, because they are related by the operation of rotation on the circle. Okay, so the concept C major chord actually encodes a tremendous degree of abstraction. We are ignoring 2 things. When we say something is a C major chord, we are ignoring what particular piano keys you're playing, because this is a C major chord, and so is this, and so is this, and so is this, and they're all C major chords. So we're ignoring which particular octave you're playing the notes in. And then when we say something is a major chord, we're actually talking not about a specific set of notes, but about a specific set of distances between the notes. Okay? And so it turns out that the human ear is incredibly sensitive to distances between notes, but really not at all sensitive to the precise location on the circle. In fact, if I played for you a C major chord, and then convinced you all to go outside and run around the building 3 or 4 times, and come back 3 minutes later, and then I said something like, okay, remember we were talking about the C major chord, and I played a C sharp major chord. Most of you would not notice at all. You cannot tell the difference between a C major chord played 5 minutes ago and a C sharp major chord played now. The people who can tell that have one of the only real life instances of an honest-to-God genetic superpower. They are people who have absolute pitch, and it does seem to be genetically determined. And so there are people who would say, no, you can't fool me. That was a C sharp major chord, not a C major chord. But most of us don't have that. And so we care much less about where you are on the circle and much more about the relations between notes on the circle. This is actually quite amazing. It's as if you couldn't tell the difference between blue and green, but you were incredibly sensitive to the fact that blue and green relate in the same way as red and orange, or something like that. Okay? All right. So here we are. We now have two fundamental ways in which musicians ignore information. They ignore the octave you're in and represent notes as points on the circle. And then they group things together based on whether they're related by rotation. And it might also interest you to know there's one, and rotation is important because it preserves distances on the circle. It's what's called an isometry, or a distance-preserving operation. There's one other operation which transforms the major chord into the minor chord. Okay? So that's reflection, which musicians call inversion. Okay, so that's a basic introduction to the situation. What can you do with this? Well, if you think through the implications, you can actually construct the space that music operates in. So, for instance, you can say, what is the geometry? What is the space of two musical voices that are indistinguishable? In other words, we cannot tell one from the other. Two indistinguishable musical voices where you don't care what octave you're in. And that is this space here. It's a Mobius strip. And it's not just an ordinary Mobius strip, it's a Mobius strip whose boundaries act in a very well-defined way as mirrors. So you can think of it as a mirrored Mobius strip, which sounds kind of 70s if you think about it in the right way. So this is that space. And in this space, you can represent any music you can play with two fingers on the piano keyboard. If I move the top voice, I move diagonally downward. If I move the bottom voice, I move diagonally the other way. And if I move both voices together, that's horizontal motion. And so that's called transposition by musicians, and that was represented on our circle as rotation. Let me show you them both at the same time. If I can make this shrink, I can put it over here. And so now we can look at these two. I wish I could shrink this, but it doesn't, it's not sitting on my keyboard. Okay, we're just gonna live with it. So you can see over on the right is rotation. Oops. And over on the left is moving through this two-dimensional space. Okay, now let's talk about the left and right boundaries. As you go off the right side, you reappear on the left side, and vice versa. So it's a little bit like those old video games like Pac-Man or Asteroids, where the monster chases you off here and you reappear over here and keep going. But if you go off the top half over here, you reappear on the bottom half over here, and vice versa. Okay? And so what looks just like rotation over here is actually this complicated passing backward and forward over here and going. Imagine these two edges are glued together with a twist. And that's what defines the Mobius strip mathematically. Okay? Now, the boundaries, the upper and lower boundaries, are the ones that act as mirrors. Imagine what happens if I send, so 0 means C and 4 means E. Imagine what happens if I switch those two notes. So the lower one goes to the position of the higher one, and the higher one goes to the position of the lower one. Well, first, let's see if I can do it like this. First, they will go to this middle point, and then as they switch, they will retrace their spot back to where they began. So what looks like trading places on the circle is actually going to look over here like bouncing off the upper boundary. So, to talk about the space in which two notes, two musical voices, where you're ignoring octave and order, to talk about the space where to talk about the geometry of that very simple musical situation, literally the musical situation that you need to represent chopsticks, you need to be able to talk mathematically about spaces that have mirrors in them. And this is something that, believe it or not, only developed in the last 50 years or so. These mirrored points are singularities, and the name of the spaces that have these singularities, the most common name is called orbifolds. Okay? So now that we have devised our space, you can literally travel all around. And transform a series of music, a two-voice musical score, into a series of paths on this space. Okay, so it turns out there's a version of this for three-note chords, which looks like this. There's a version of this for four-note chords because the four-note chords, which is a four-dimensional space. And I can't show it to you because I'm using my old laptop, which only does 3D graphics. But all of the spaces are essentially similar in structure. Believe it or not, the space that musicians operate in is a kind of mirrored donut. And it's the Mobius strip I was showing you is really a two-dimensional mirrored donut. This space is a three-dimensional mirrored donut, and there's 4 and 5 and even 50-dimensional mirrored donuts. But really, all of these spaces are fundamentally similar in that they have one circular dimension, and then it's a kind of ball. The rest of the dimensions are a kind of ball or simplex if you're mathematically inclined, and the notes go bouncing off those other dimensions. And so really, it's that circular dimension that is fundamental. Okay, so what can you do with these spaces? Well, it turns out that composers know these spaces. They do not know them as Mobius strips or mirrored donuts or as higher dimensional spaces. They know them in their fingers as ways to get around that thing, the piano keyboard. And having spent thousands of hours exploring all the different ways of getting from one chord to another, composers move inside these spaces with a kind of astonishing systematicity. And so in my book, I go through examples of interesting systematicity from the Renaissance to rock music, right? And you can see composers like Chopin, almost like mathematicians, demonstrating multiple pathways, demonstrating all possible pathways through a pair of points in a four-dimensional space. So one thing that you can do with these spaces is represent traditional music in a new way, and in doing that transformation, in making that new representation, you can see clear as day structure that is much more obscured in traditional musical notation. The other thing that we're going to talk about for the rest of this talk is you can maybe use these spaces to come up with new ways of thinking about music. And so before turning this over to Nathan, I want to just introduce two concepts that are going to be important in the piece that we wrote and also in Nathan's part of the talk. The first thing is that this way of thinking gives you a totally new way of thinking about what a musical scale is, okay? So in this space, remember I was saying earlier, these spaces are continuous, and these spaces, they don't really care whether you're playing white notes or black notes or whether you're between those notes. Anything you can imagine is on this Mobius strip. Of course, in most music, we do limit ourselves to a smaller collection of notes. The piano forces us to limit ourselves to just 12 possible notes in the octave. But actually, most music is even more constrictive than that. There's a lot of music that just uses the white notes or some version of the white notes. So one natural question that arises is how does this process of limiting yourself to a smaller collection or a musical scale, how is it represented here? And to answer that question, I want to sort of answer it in two ways. The first thing that I want to say, so here are the white notes, okay? So one thing that we can think of the white notes just as a chord with 7 elements. So you can think of it as a point in the 7-dimensional space containing all possible 7-note chords. And that's a very useful way to think. But scales do something very important for us beyond that, which is that scales give us a way of measuring musical distance. For instance, if we take that very simple tune, you might ask, well, what's the relation between these first 3 notes and the second 3 notes? And if we think in terms of the chromatic scale, they are not at all the same. To play do-a-dir, if you're measuring distance in terms of keys on the piano, it should sound like this. Which is very strange. It turns out that in almost all music, we have to be thinking about 2 different kinds of distance. One is distance counting black keys and white keys, but the other is distance within the musical scale that we are currently playing. And once you think about this simple tune in that way, this is up 1, up 1, this is up 1, up 1, and it's a single pattern being shifted along the scale. And of course, this is a didactic tune designed to teach kids music, and part of what it's teaching is how to think about musical distance in terms of just the white notes. So a way of putting this point is that what a musical scale gives you is a way of measuring distance in this space. And a musical scale is literally what mathematicians call a metric. Okay? And the most popular scales are the ones that define a way of measuring distance that is roughly compatible with the distance you get from the chromatic scale or all the notes on the piano keyboard. So this is my Mobius strip now where I show only the white notes and where these lines identify the white notes that are most proximate to each other. And I actually think it looks a little bit like a topographical map. It looks a little bit like a grid city that's seen from above, like San Francisco. You know? So you can imagine all of these are city blocks, but some of them are going uphill, and because we're in a helicopter, they don't look as long as all the others. So this concept is one of the animating metaphors that I gave to Nathan when he started working on the visuals for our project together. And it's the metaphor of a grid. And so the idea is that different musical scales define literally different grid structures in these space of all possible chords. So that's one of the things that he will be showing you in just a few minutes. The other thing that I wanted to talk about very briefly is the second metaphor, which is the metaphor of threads. Okay? So Nathan and I wanted to use this geometry not just to analyze pre-existing music by Chopin or Debussy or the Beatles or whatnot, but to try to come up with new ways of thinking about music that hadn't been tried before. The problem with this is twofold. Basically, traditional musical syntax evolved over the course of centuries, right? And so it started extremely simply. And then decade by decade, composers got more complex and listeners got attuned to new structures. For people like Nathan and me, we are basically trying to skip hundreds of years of musical evolution and present you with new structures. And that it seems like we either have to write very didactic, simplistic music, which maybe isn't as fun to listen to, or we have to figure out, we run the risk of losing our audience. And one of the things that's a particular challenge is humans are incredibly good at seeing patterns visually. And mathematics itself is a whole language for grasping patterns that are hard to intuit with our senses. Musically, we are not always so strong at recognizing structure. And I speak as someone who teaches college freshmen. It's very hard to get people to learn to represent even, to reliably identify even the most simple musical structures. So the idea that we had was that we are going to use Nathan's visuals to kind of reinforce and represent some of these new structures that people haven't represented before. So the last thing that I want to just leave you with is our second metaphor, the metaphor of threads. It turns out that if you could see the geometrical spaces containing all possible chords, whether they have 2 notes or 4 notes or 7 notes, you would see that there are a whole variety of patterns that are essentially analogous. And that in many, many cases, when you're dealing with scales of a certain kind and chords of a certain kind, even though these chords and scales don't seem at all similar to each other, they define a structure that is isomorphic or fundamentally similar. And so when I was working on the music for our collaboration, I was taken with this and I started to try to explore these isomorphic analogous musical situations, and we call them threads because basically what you find are all the versions of a chord are strung together like beads on a necklace in a circular structure. So I'm just going to play you a few examples of completely isomorphic musical patterns that are literally translations of each other that play a role in our piece. And then Nathan will come up and start talking about how he represented these and other aspects of the music. So this is actually a set of chords. They're very complex chords that are a little bit consonant and a little bit dissonant, and they open the our piece, and I'll just play them for you. Each chord lasts a long time because they're so complex, you kind of want to let them sit in. Can we turn that up just a little bit? Possibly we can. Okay, and then there we are, back to a version of what we started with. And so that's one turn around the necklace containing these very complicated chords. Believe it or not, there is a totally analogous necklace that is incredibly simple, that just has 2 note chords. So the things I played you before are kind of the main chords of the opening of the piece, and these play a central role in the middle of the piece. Now, the thing is, the challenge for us as people who want to use these geometrical relationships is that these things really don't sound very much alike at all. And yet, there are analogous moves, so any move I make with those first chords has a kind of translation into this very different 2-note context. And so the challenge that we faced, and that I guess I'm going to continue to face as I keep thinking more about these things, is how to take these relationships that are real and are totally obvious if you understand the underlying structural geometry, and how to make them manifest in a way that even a sort of casual listener can represent. Okay, recognize. So I'm going to leave things there. Thank you very much. We're going to bring Nathan up and have a quick changeover of computers. Thank
Thank you. All right, that was easy, right? By the way, a 50-dimensional mirrored donut sounds like the most delicious thing I've ever heard of. Making my mouth water. So, my name is Nathan Selikoff, and I'm also very pleased and excited to be here, and thankful for everyone who made it possible for us to be here and bring this collaboration to life. I have gotten to know Dmitri through another Bridges, the Bridges Math and Art Conference that happens once a year. And it's a community of people like all of you who are sitting out there and enjoying the intersections and bridges between different disciplines. So my background is in visual art and computer science. I grew up in a household where my mom was a fine artist and my dad a software engineer. So those different influences have mixed in my life, and I'm thinking a lot about that that wheel with the notes on it and the analogies between the spacing out of the major chords and a color wheel. We should definitely do a color wheel with the notes, because you have the concept of a triad in color theory, and you have the concept of analogous colors and complementary colors. And it's all about the space between the colors on the color wheel. So I think there's, when we start talking about math and music and art, there's a lot of kind of synesthesia that's going on. There's a lot of language that can map between the different disciplines. And that plays into the creative process for this piece as well. So Dmitri's composing a piece of music, but he's also writing prose about it in order to explain to me the mathematical concepts. And as I read those words that he's written, I think of visual things that I can do to represent the pieces. So I want to give you a little bit of background and discussion about the intersection between visual art and mathematics and computation, because that's kind of the space where I live in, and that is what I enjoy exploring and kind of how I approach the creative process as a visual artist. So a lot of my work has been based on a mathematical form called a strange attractor. And I think strange attractors are fascinating because they are kind of this object that has an infinite amount of detail. You can keep on zooming in and looking like a fractal, like many of you have probably seen. But there's also kind of this visual relationship to natural phenomenon like clothing or ink in water or fabric waving in the wind, different things like that. But these images are mathematically generated through very simple equations and parameters that go into those equations. And I think of these spaces, these mathematical spaces, as a landscape that I can explore. So sometimes when I talk to people about the process of creating algorithmic art, I liken it to walking through a forest with a camera, and you might snap a bunch of photographs of what you're experiencing in that space, and then you might go later and kind of filter through your photographs and pick out ones that you think have some compositional interest or some textural interest or something like that. So that's similar to kind of how an algorithmic artist might work. They work within the context of a system that might be able to produce an infinite number of images, but it's kind of the idea of selecting or exploring that virtual space. And a lot of the parallels to me between the abstract mathematics and the visuals that those can produce and nature are really interesting. So just looking at this satellite photo of an alluvial fan, which is where the river comes out, and kind of spreads out, and the borders between the natural spaces and the man-made spaces. So you have the kind of grid-like structures of the fields of irrigation, juxtaposed with the rough kind of fractal terrain aspects. And really those borders are where the really interesting things are happening. And that's true in the context of mathematical algorithms, and that's true, I believe, in the context of learning and liberal arts and borders between these different disciplines. So the history of chaos is kind of interesting. Chaos filters into this idea of strange attractors as well. And this is a musical visualization of something called the three-body problem. So in the late 1800s, the King of Sweden established a prize for anyone who could find the solution to this problem. And the announcement was very specific. Given a system of arbitrarily many mass points that attract each according to Newton's law, under the assumption that no 2 points ever collide, try to find a representation of the coordinates of each point as a series in a variable that is some known function of time, and for all of whose values the series converges uniformly. That problem was solved by Poincaré, and he was awarded the prize. And while he was studying it, he discovered that there were chaotic orbits in certain cases. So the orbits of the bodies were not periodic, so they were not repeating. They were not divergent, they didn't escape to infinity, and they were not convergent, they didn't collapse. He found this new type of orbit, a chaotic orbit. Skipping way forward to the 60s, there was kind of this confluence between different things happening in mathematics and different things happening in computer science. So in mathematics, we have kind of the birth of fractals and chaos to a certain extent. You've got Mandelbrot publishing his famous paper about posing the question, what is the length of the coastline of Britain? And describing that it depends on how long your measuring stick is. So if you start with a very large ruler, you'll get a certain distance of the coastline, and as you shrink that ruler, you will find that the coastline expands. You get a smaller ruler, the coastline is longer, and that speaks to the fractal geometry of the coastline being something that's not quite two-dimensional, it's kind of in between dimensions. You also have Lorentz, who is a meteorologist, trying to come up with a system of equations that could predict climate, so that could predict the weather looking forward, and he discovers some kind of chaotic effects within some of those systems of equations. What you're seeing on the left there is the Lorentz attractor. In computer science, you have the introduction of new programming languages that are really targeted towards kids, towards people who have never programmed before, things like BASIC and Logo. I remember when I was in middle school, definitely doing Logo programming, and telling the little turtle, some people know it as turtle graphics, telling that turtle to move forward a certain amount and rotate a certain number of degrees. Basic algorithms, basically teaching people how to speak to a computer in a language that the computer would understand. In the art world in the 60s, you have a lot of artists who are experimenting with computers through places like Bell Labs, where they're sitting with engineers, software and hardware engineers, in these computers that take up the size of rooms or closets, and thinking through ideas. What if we could tell the computer to do this? What if we could tell the computer to draw this type of image? And so on the left, you have Vera Molnar. She did a lot of the early work on this. Ivan Moscovich in the middle. They both created physical machines that explored algorithms. I heard that Anita built a harmonograph here as part of the last lecture series. So the idea of a harmonograph was explored by different artists. And then on the right, you have Sol LeWitt, who fits into this period of conceptual art where the process is more important than the output. So Sol LeWitt would come up with literally an algorithm for a work of art and say, follow these 5 or 6 steps, and then he would hand that algorithm to assistants to actually execute the wall drawing. So I think of these different disciplines as kind of lying along this image on the top, which is a graph of the logistic equation, which is a very, very simple equation that also exhibits chaotic effects, where it goes from being very ordered to exploding into these things called bifurcations, where it branches out like a tree, then exploding into chaos for certain parameters. And the confluence of these different disciplines kind of coming together and producing new ways for people to make art and music and explore science and explore mathematics. So I come into this in the 80s, and like I mentioned, growing up around computers and growing up around art as well, and science and appreciating nature. My first computer being the Commodore 64. And this thing was great. It's, you know, you turn it on and you're greeted by this blinking cursor, and it's like this pulse of possibility, and it's just asking you to do something. There's no, there's no operating system really. There's nothing there for you to do besides you could put in some programs and tell it to run the programs, but you could also just start programming it. You could start typing in basic code. And so I had a magazine that I used to get as a kid called 321 Contact, and in the back they had very simple basic programs. So not knowing what I was doing, as a young person, I would just type it in and make some typos and nothing would work, and I'd go back through and very carefully fix the mistakes, and then a game or an animation or some kind of interactive thing would come up on the screen, which was pretty magical. So I've used these different ideas in my work, and over the past 10 years or so as a fine artist, combining technology and interests in mathematics and science and nature. So I have a few different interactive pieces to show you here. So when I look at a mathematical system and use that as an inspiration for a piece, I'm not necessarily trying to make something that a mathematician would look at and say, oh yes, that's a very accurate representation of this concept. So in this piece, I was exploring a four-dimensional parameter space, and I did it in a way that an artist would do it. It's not, I've got an X and Y axis on the whole image on the left-hand side, and then I've got little grids and X and Y in there. It's not representative of the math in a didactic way. It's more of a kind of interpretation of it. Dmitri showed you his kind of theremin with the leap motion controller. This is a software that I wrote for the leap motion controller as well, kind of a visual theremin, taking that idea of the strange attractors and allowing you to more directly control those parameters that change the shape and change the motion. So I've also more recently been doing collaborations with composers, and a few years ago I did another piece where I did live visuals with an orchestra with a friend of mine in Orlando who's a composer, and this piece explored the idea of different dimensions and kind of moving from the idea of one dimension to 2 to 3 to 4. So just to give you a sense of kind of what the finished product might look like, because I'm going to show you some work in progress that's not really, done yet. So that was a piece from, I think it was 2012. All right, so now getting more into the collaboration between Dmitri and I. So back last June, Dmitri sent me, this email kind of describing the piece and that we were a go for it. And yeah, he said, basically what he said earlier to you is like it's difficult to do what we're trying to do. It's difficult to take these mathematical ideas and try and express them in the music and try and express them in the visuals in a way that is not simplistic, in a way that produces a artistic work that will be engaging, but also hints at or draws you into kind of the depth of the mathematics that ties everything together. So a little bit of my artistic process in kind of digesting this, taking lots and lots of notes, lots of phone conversations with Dmitri, where I say, what exactly is a grid again? What is the thread? Can you describe that again? You know, trying to work through different ideas, brainstorming different ideas, listening to early versions of the composition and of the different movements, starting to do, you know, different sketches, and kind of explore, okay, how can we bring some of these simple shapes together and explore them in a way that's going to be interesting. And where it gets real is when Dmitri sends you 5 pages of annotations on exactly what's happening in every movement of the piece. So that actually has been extremely helpful. As you can see, I've marked them up quite a bit, and this is really interesting to me because listen to some of the words that I pulled out that Dmitri used to describe those big chords. So he played those stacked chords moving through that thread space in the beginning of the first movement. Some of the words that he used to describe those: big, dissonant, brass, they articulate a thread, fanfare, vigorous, joyous. And then some contrasting things that are happening in the first movement, the idea of static, frenetic, energetic, twinkling, chaos, random, glimmering points of light, crazy lines, intersections. So I find it really interesting, the parallels between the language and how visual the language can be. And I find this to be true with mathematics as well. When mathematicians are describing the things that they are working with, it's often very visual, even more visual sometimes than they want to admit. So yeah, in the first movement we have this idea of static, and we're kind of contrasting the big chords moving along this thread with this twinkling chaos of the static. And just to give you a little overview of the other movements, the second movement, we are going to focus on the idea of the thread. And the third movement is called shape, and there's some interesting things going on with, so go back to thinking about the movement of those 2-note chords, and as those notes go back and forth along those lines, if you imagine tracing out those movements, tracing out lines, then you have the idea of as a note moves back and forth in one voice of the orchestra, you have basically a line segment. And if you have 2 voices moving together or moving asynchronously, then you have kind of a plane or a square that gets outlined. You can extend that into 3 dimensions and into 4 dimensions and beyond. So we're exploring some of those ideas in the third movement. The fourth movement is kind of inspired by the idea of rain, or all the different moods that you get from rain: peaceful, lazy, lethargic, driving. And then the fifth movement will have some interesting ideas with echoes, but I don't want to talk too much about that. I want to show you guys some stuff. So, okay, we saw the grids. Let me talk about the threads a little bit more. So these are some of the images that Dmitri sent me to explain the threads, or the movements of those chords through different spaces. And something that's interesting about what he was talking about is that on the keyboard you have the octave, and it goes and it wraps around in the circle, and there's ways to look at it. You can look at it stretched out, you can look at it in a circle, you can look at it as a torus. So I'm trying to find visual ways to take the idea of a thread and interpret it artistically that hints at the idea that it's linear, but also the idea that it wraps around on itself, and also the idea that it exists in higher dimensional spaces. So let me switch over. I'm going to show you this one without music first. Bear with me just a second. I don't know why that part's not working. Let me see if I can get this up on the screen here. Okay, there's going to be a lot of like ambient light here, so it's going to be a little hard to see. But this is one kind of scene that I'm working on. So we're actually inside of a donut. And the donut has been tessellated into a grid, and the vertices of the grid have been kind of perturbed to look like a landscape. And I'm just going to move the camera around here a little bit. So what I'm going to try and do in this space is pull out these lines that run through the space. And the idea of this is for the echoes movement. So the idea is that you've got the grid that represents the space that you can work in within the scale. And then you've got melodies that trace themselves through the grid of that visual space. So imagine, you're inside this donut and you've got kind of things happening in the orchestral piece, and you've got these lines tracing themselves through and around, and there's lights and things happening. So that is one scene that I'm working on. And let me see if I can get this one working. Oh, I know what was wrong. Okay, I'm going to attempt to play a little bit of the first movement in the MIDI version. So you have to imagine, it's going to be amazing next month with the full orchestra. And I will have practiced everything that I'm doing, but I just want to give you a little bit of a taste of what part of this might look like as a work in progress. Okay, enough caveats. Okay, so just a little bit of a taste of kind of some of the things that I'm playing with. So I'll be triggering the visuals live with different devices and kind of watching the conductor and bringing these things together. And there'll be some parts that are more synchronized with the orchestra and what they're doing. There'll be some parts where it breaks off and kind of goes on itself and explores different areas. And there'll be different layers of textures and grittiness and things. This is, imagine you're looking at like, pre-renders from a Pixar movie, as Dmitri was saying earlier. So yeah, that's just a little bit of behind the scenes on the creative process from the way that it looks from my perspective. So yeah, shall we open it up for Q&A?
Just a request, everybody, because we are recording this series, if you have questions, please go to one of the mics here, and we'll alternate back and forth taking your questions.
Good evening. Thank you for your great talks. I'm wondering, so we've seen like I think the musical system, like the Western musical system, like since the 1400s. I'm wondering, what do other musical systems, how do they fit into the theory? Like, you know, like.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a great question that deserves a really long answer. So one of the things I didn't talk about is that there's actually a beautiful analogy between the kinds of structures that you have in the pitch domain, notes, and structures you find in the rhythmic domain. So pitch space is circular, you know, T takes us back to do, but rhythmic space is also circular. You know, if you think 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 4 takes you back to 1. And so you find these amazing analogies. For instance, in Ghana, there is a rhythm that is so popular, it's called the timeline, and the rhythm sounds like, okay? And the timeline, believe it or not, I'm gonna play both the rhythm. The timeline is this. It is the rhythmic translation of our major scale. And so, in the rhythmic domain, you find things like that pattern basically modulates from C major to G major as you go 200 miles away in Ghana. So in the rhythmic domain, there are these beautiful analogies that apply to a lot of music. There are kinds of music like Georgian folk polyphony from the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, or Thai music modulates using 5-note scales within an equal-tempered 7-note scale. So there are a lot of places where you can sort of basically see non-Western cultures doing exactly what you can find in Western music. That said, there is also a lot of non-Western music that basically does not have changing harmonies as we know them from Western music, right? So there's a lot of non-Western music that is sort of focused on a single melody or a static harmony. And that kind of music is not particularly, that kind of pitch structure is not particularly conducive to the kinds of models that I explore. My models are great if you've got chords with 2 or more notes that change relatively frequently. So there's plenty of drone-based music, monophonic music, et cetera, where these models just don't work, and you know, life's tough. There's no one model to rule them all, and there's no one theory that's going to cover all the world's music. I've made my peace with that. The other thing to say is that if I had to encapsulate the history of 20th century music in a single sentence, it would be that they gave us the drum set and we gave them our chords. And so if you go anywhere in the world now, you will find music that has chords, you know, familiar Western chords that are changing rapidly, but also that music draws on the indigenous folk music that's being made in that region. So you go to India, you'll hear stuff that's like Indian inflected versions of Western popular music, and you hear that in Thailand, and you hear that all over the place. So, you know, musical cultures are blending in a way, and so there is a lot of music all over the world that you can model using my techniques. But again, there's just a ton of stuff you can't model using my techniques, and so you have to have realistic expectations for you know, any theory is going to have music it really works on, music it doesn't work on, and you know.
I have a question about the visuals that you're creating to go with the music. Are they fixed, or is there a performance aspect or something that reacts to the music through a microphone, for example?
Yeah, so it's all real time, and part of it's going to be controlled with this little guy, which is just kind of some sliders and buttons and things, almost like a mini soundboard. So basically it's up to me, you know, what in the system that I'm exploring, what I want to show there. Let me see if I can get it back up on the screen here. So like I've got one slider that's attached to the rotation of the camera and how many particles are kind of being spewed from these tetrahedra. And you know, this is kind of a multiplier on the particles. So for every kind of scene and situation that I have, I'm going to give myself enough but not too many hooks into it. And then I will most likely also bring in some live audio feeds. So for instance, like the way that the tetrahedra is kind of scaling itself right now is based on some noise functions. But it would be great to have that based on kind of the overall volume of what's going on in the piece, or maybe particular frequencies. So yes, all those things can play into what's happening in the visuals.
So this is for Dmitri. I heard you speak like 5 or 6 years ago, and if I'm remembering correctly, somebody asked you then how you felt the intellectual yoga of your geometric music theory related to your artistic practice as a composer. And your answer then was, it's like lifting weights, where it's not the same as playing football, but it's good for you. And hearing you speak tonight, it sounds like you've integrated that more into your artistic practice. So my question is, like, if that's true, and how the process of integrating that is being.
Well, yeah. Well, first, thanks for coming back. And yeah, I probably did say that. One of the things that I was thinking about as Nathan was talking is that the challenge of what we're trying to do is we're trying to combine 3 really different kinds of beauty, right? There's what you might call intrinsic musical beauty, which is just the wow you get through your ears, you know, wow. And great composers are all about that wow. And then there's a visual analog of that, the visual wow. You just look at a painting or, you know, a movie and you just, oh, it looks gorgeous. And then there's also mathematical beauty, right? So I am fully convinced it is mathematically beautiful that the fact that those 2 passages I played you, which sound totally different, are in fact the same fundamental structure. So you're right that in the past, I mean, part of the problem here is that I feel like a lot of 20th century music went wrong by emphasizing the mathematical beauty at the expense of the intrinsic musical beauty. And that was true of some of my own teachers, mentors. A composer named Milton Babbitt was very helpful to me when I was young, but he really was focused on these relations between notes that had no audible character. And I felt I didn't ever want to go down that road. Now, I've really liked sort of doing this project with Nathan, and I must confess, I thought, wow, I got to keep exploring these ideas because I've really only scratched the surface. But I guess I would just say that for me, I'm really alive to the fact that maybe some of these relationships really, it's a mathematical beauty, and others of these relationships are a musical beauty. Working with Nathan has in a way freed me not to worry about that problem so much because he's my safety net. He's got my back. And you know, you might not be able to hear that this chord progression is related to that chord progression, but Nathan can make you see that, you know. And so that really is a different situation. And I think I've got to go meditate and think a little bit about what the next step is or where I go forward. I wish I had the blind faith that mathematical beauty translates easily into musical beauty, but I don't. And so I don't want to lose myself in a world of mathematical relationships that has no output for the listener. You know, but you're right that I'm more interested in exploring that connection. And I also think that there's a certain number of listeners who are willing to give me the benefit of the doubt in saying, oh, okay, so you're going to explore these geometrical relations musically? That's interesting. I mean, I'll listen. You know, I might not be able to hear the details of the correspondences, but I'm interested in that sort of project. So that's where I'm at now. Thanks.
So you've discussed of how maybe this is going through many, many years of evolution of music and the need to bring visual to help train us, the audience, in such a concert, on maybe train us into accepting what's happening. Do you feel the need also to train the musician and the conductor in order to, or have you explained this, or are you explaining this to them to create the, is this difficult for them to accept as well?
Well, I sent Edwin a free copy of my book, The Conductor. So. I think the brief answer to that is no, because in an orchestra context, conductors and instrumentalists have very well-defined jobs, and they're highly trained professionals at performing their jobs. And so they look and they play the note at the right time in the right volume, and they make little marks. The conductor says, no, you got to be a little quieter, and they write a, mezzo forte. And it's a little bit like, a 19th century symphonic poem that's about, your beloved, or Till Eulenspiegel's pranks, or, the musicians don't need to know that. It can be distracting. Some like to know it, but some are just gonna, do their job. And the crazy thing about a symphonic context is that each musician is really a tiny part of this gigantic multicellular organism, right? And so they only see a small portion of the overall thing. I think I might feel a little bit different if it was a solo pianist or some situation like that. But in this context, no, I think I would probably annoy most professional musicians if I started saying, okay, 4-dimensional tetrahedra happening here. Do you want that loud or soft? Do you mean B flat? Okay. Any more questions? I think no one's lined up. Oh, here's one.
So you didn't say anything about harmonics when you were doing the chords.
Yeah.
And I just wonder the harmonics of any of those, if that plays into the art at all, or going the harmonics above, or sometimes you hear harmonics below. So harmonics are notes that you hear when you put two chords together. You're going to hear another note that's an echo of that in some kind of way.
Oh, you mean combination tones? Harmonics are I think of harmonics as overtones.
Right, overtones.
Okay.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So that's a question, right? Really, I need to go back to the drawing board and show you all of my models all over again. Because really, so my models, the geometries that I showed you are actually insensitive to one of the most fundamental aspects of music, which is consonance versus dissonance. So there's just, there have been lectures about this in this very series, there's just a fundamental difference between a sound like this and a sound like this, right? So one is stable, restful, the other is agitated, dissonant. We say this one is dissonant, this is really dissonant, this is really stable. The geometry doesn't care about that. So one of the things that there was an undergraduate at Princeton who, when my first papers on this stuff came out, he wanted to put dissonance into the model, and he made beautiful versions of the Mobius strip that were colored in terms of how consonant or dissonant a particular chord was. And so, yeah, you are absolutely right. That's a whole other dimension of music that, in a way, it would be great to try to put into the model. For a bunch of technical reasons, dissonance is very, very hard to model reliably and quantitatively. You can't even talk about the dissonance of a chord, as I'm sure some of you have heard before. This is a C major chord, the most consonant chord imaginable. But if you play it down here, it becomes pretty, actually it sounds good down here on this piano, but it becomes pretty consonant, dissonant, right? A major will be better, right? Okay, that's a consonance? That's a major chord? That sounds like a drum. And so I once heard a wonderful story about the great composer Dalla Piccola, a brilliant 20th century Italian composer, and one of my teachers studied with him, and he grabbed my teacher by the lapels and said, "The problem with Schoenberg is he never understood the difference between this and he played the same notes in all the different octaves." And his point was the notes that down here are thunderous and terrifying and dissonant, that's not dissonant at all. That's a whole other thing. So you find similar things with timbre, the precise structure of your notes, volume. One of the theories about why heavy metal guitarists rarely play the third of the chord and just play the root and the fifth is because the distorted electric guitar at 120 decibels is already so dissonant, just in terms of the structure of its sound, that you actually need to simplify the chord because the timbre is providing the dissonance. So yeah, I have done some exploring of how you could put dissonance into this model. Obviously, one of the things that I'm playing with in the piece of music is you find two different threads that are structurally analogous, and there's mathematical beauty between them and so on, but maybe one is more consonant and restful, and one of them is more dissonant and agitated, and so you can use that as a musical parameter that you play with. Okay.
Real quick on the visual side, of things, not for this piece, but for another piece I worked on, spectrogram or spectrograph is a great way to see the harmonics of different sound. And basically, if you see high frequencies on the outside and low frequencies on the inside, and see the way that certain things, there's church bells or birds or the human voice or different instruments, you can actually visually see the harmonics of certain tonalities in that type of visual format.
This relates to what you were just saying about dissonance and consonance and building it into your model. Now, your model only talks about notes of a scale, like, position in a circle. And, I think to build dissonance into such a model, you would have to take into account the spectrum of the particular instrument that you're using and look at the relationship between all the harmonics that are present in one given note, so to speak.
Yeah, actually, so my friend Bill Sathers has written a tremendous book called Tuning Timbre Spectrum Scale. So one thing that actually I've toyed with, and other people have also played with this idea, is actually the idea to use my model to represent relations among overtones, right? So to try to capture some phenomena in terms of, you can get dissonances between single notes played after each other. And people have the intuition that what's going on there is something like voice leading, but the voice leading is happening in the spectra, right? And so there's some technical reasons that make this hard to work out. It's very hard to figure out why the tritone should be dissonant under that model. But it does seem to, like, if you just model the three lowest harmonics, it gives you a nice hint at why we find perfect fifths to be consonant even when they're played one after another. But it does make the wrong prediction about them. So maybe you can help me figure out how to get the tritone to work right. But yeah, spectral structure is the problem with dissonance, and that's why you can't talk about the dissonance of this chord or that chord. It's, you really have to be more precise.
One last question. First of all, thank you for a very fascinating evening. I'm just curious about orchestration. You've talked about the notes and the chords, and I know that when I go and hear this concert, which I will be, that you're going to be assigning different notes to different instruments, also known as orchestration. How did you approach that?
Wow, that's a great question. In this piece, I did something I usually, if I'm writing a big ensemble piece, I just compose I just write right into the orchestra score like Shostakovich did. In this one, I did what Stravinsky did and wrote a piano version first. And then, and so the earliest things I sent Nathan were like, 8 pianos playing the piece. You know, the thing about orchestration, it's very simplistic, but it's really important. All of the orchestra instruments have their particular quality and their particular, you know, the trombone is nasal and aggressive, and the clarinets are softer, and really what would happen is I would try things out. I say, okay, I'm going to put this in the bassoons, you know, and I just would listen and, you know, have my computer synthesize it. I'd say, that just sounds terrible. That's totally wrong. And what was happening is the character of that instrument was just not right for the melody or the chord as I'd imagined it. And so it's a certain amount of just trial and error. And then, you know, as I went on, I got better at it. And so by the end, I was more reliably. But some of it you just have to, you know, let's try the winds. No, that didn't work.
Not mathematical.
No, not math. Ooh, no. That's asking for trouble. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Before I ask you to join me and thank our two speakers, just a reminder that we have 2 further public lectures coming up. First of all, in this room on Friday, April 8th, is the last of the St. Jerome's University 150th anniversary lectures. It's a panel on First Nations in Canada seeking true reconciliation. And as already mentioned before, but just to remind you, Friday and Saturday, April 22nd, 23rd, at the Conrad Center in Kitchener, part of the KW Symphony Intersection Series. The work you've been hearing about tonight between Dmitri and Nathan will be performed in conjunction with the KW Symphony Orchestra. The title of it is The Geometry of Music, Harold Scott, MacDonald, Coxeter. I assume tickets are available. Further information will be available. It's in the brochure. So those are the 2 final things. And there's a reception to go. But before then, just again, please ask you to join me in thanking. Thank you.